The American Mafia was built on a single principle above all others: loyalty. The oath every made member swore at his initiation committed him to the organization before everything else in his life, his family, his freedom, and ultimately his survival. The penalty for breaking that oath was understood by everyone who took it. What follows are the 10 cases where men broke it anyway, and what happened as a result. Every one of them is documented, verified, and on the public record. ABE, Kid Twist, Relis, 1940. Before Joseph Valachi, before Sammy Gravano, before any of the names that became synonymous with mob cooperation in the post-war decades, there was Abraham Relis. He was not a peripheral figure. He was one of the most prolific contract killers in the history of organized crime, an enforcer for Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the national syndicate that carried out contract killings on behalf of every major organized crime organization in the country during the 1930s. His personal involvement in murders numbered in the dozens. Witnesses and investigators later estimated that the network he belonged to was responsible for between 400 and 1,000 killings across its operational period. In 1940, a minor associate's arrest began unraveling the Brooklyn operation. Relis, facing murder charges that carried the death penalty, made a calculation. On March 23, 1940, he began talking to Brooklyn Assistant District Attorney Burton Turkis. What he provided over the months that followed was extraordinary in its scope and detail. Relis had a photographic memory and no apparent reluctance to use it. He gave investigators information on approximately 85 murders in Brooklyn alone, named names, provided dates and locations, and described the operational structure of the national syndicate in terms that law enforcement had never previously had access to from the inside. Several of his former colleagues went to the electric chair directly as a result of his testimony. Louis Lepke Buchalter, the only major American organized crime figure ever executed by the state, was sent to the electric chair at Sing Sing in 1944 on evidence that traced in part to Relis. He was placed under around-the-clock protection at the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, a sixth-floor suite guarded in rotation by 18 police officers. On the morning of November 12, 1941, the night before he was scheduled to testify against Albert Anastasia, Relis was found dead on the kitchen roof several floors below his window. A makeshift rope of knotted sheets was found attached to a radiator inside his room. The official explanation, that he fell to his death while attempting to lower himself to the floor below, was recorded by the grand jury that reviewed the case in 1951, which simultaneously condemned multiple aspects of the investigation's conduct, including the failure to secure the crime scene and the unaccounted hours between Relis's last confirmed sighting and the discovery of his body. 5 members of the police protection detail were demoted. No criminal charges were ever filed. The case against Anastasia collapsed immediately, and Anastasia walked free. Lucky Luciano later reportedly claimed the police had been paid $50,000 to throw Relis from the window. The building was demolished in the 1990s. The question of how Abe Relis left the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel has never been conclusively answered. Joseph Valachi, 1963. The significance of Joseph Valachi's betrayal is not what it did to any individual or family. It is what it did to the American government's ability to understand what it was actually fighting. Before Valachi took the stand before the Senate McClellan Committee on September 25, 1963, the federal government had no publicly documented evidence that a national organized crime syndicate existed. J. Edgar Hoover had spent decades dismissing the idea that Mafia, as an institution, with its commission, its 5 families, its initiation rights, its internal hierarchy, was, from the government's official perspective, essentially a media invention. Valachi was a Genovese family soldier who had spent 30 years in the organization beginning in 1930. He was serving a 15-year sentence for narcotics trafficking when, at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he shared a facility with his boss, Vito Genovese, also imprisoned on narcotics charges. Genovese, suspecting Valachi of having become an informant, reportedly gave him what the organization referred to as the kiss of death, a signal that he had been marked for killing. Valachi, believing that a fellow prisoner was his assigned killer, beat the man to death with a metal pipe. It was the wrong person. Now facing a second life sentence and with a $100,000 bounty on his head from the Genovese family, Valachi agreed to cooperate. His 11 days of nationally televised testimony before the Senate Committee in October 1963 produced the first detailed public account of the American Mafia's structure, rules, hierarchy, and history by a made member. He described the commission. He named the bosses of the 5 families. He explained the initiation ceremony, the Omerta oath, the rules of conduct, and the organizational terminology, soldiers, capos, underbosses, that the organization used internally. Attorney General Robert Kennedy called it the biggest single intelligence breakthrough yet in combating organized crime. Within years of his testimony, Congress had enacted the court-ordered wiretap statute that would give the FBI the tools it had previously lacked, established the Federal Witness Protection Program that would subsequently shelter hundreds of cooperating witnesses, and laid the legislative groundwork for the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1970, the statute that would be used 20 years later to prosecute and convict the leadership of all 5 New York families simultaneously. Valachi died of a heart attack at the La Tuna Federal Prison in Texas in April 1971, having never left protective custody. Donnie Brasco, 1981. FBI Special Agent Joseph Pistone's penetration of the Bonanno crime family from 1976 to 1981 was not a betrayal in the conventional sense. Pistone had never taken an oath to the organization he was infiltrating, but in terms of its consequences for the family that trusted him, it was the most damaging act of betrayal in the history of the American Mafia's relationship with law enforcement, and it succeeded precisely because the organization's own rules, specifically the rule requiring third-party introduction of made members, failed to screen him out. Pistone began his undercover operation in 1975, presenting himself as Donnie Brasco, a Florida-based jewel thief looking to fence merchandise through New York mob contacts. Over the following 6 years, he was introduced through the Bonanno family's vouching chain, becoming progressively more embedded in the organization through his relationship with soldier Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, and eventually through his connection to acting Captain Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano. By 1981, Napolitano had proposed Pistone for formal initiation as a made member, a development that, had it occurred, would have represented the most spectacular penetration of the American Mafia by law enforcement in the organization's history. The FBI pulled Pistone out in July 1981 before the initiation could proceed. The consequences were immediate and severe. 2 days later, FBI agents informed Napolitano of what had happened. Napolitano, who had personally vouched for Pistone and whose reputation was destroyed by the revelation, reportedly gave his jewelry to his favorite bartender and the keys to his apartment to a friend so his pet pigeons could be fed. He was killed in August 1982. Anthony Mira, the soldier who had first introduced Pistone to the family, was killed in February 1982 on orders from Joseph Massino. Ruggiero was arrested before he could be killed. The Bonanno family was expelled from the commission in the scandal's aftermath. Pistone's testimony in the trials that followed produced more than 200 indictments and over 100 convictions. A $500,000 contract on Pistone's life was issued by the organization. He and his family have lived under assumed identities at undisclosed locations ever since. Tommaso Buscetta, 1984. While the American families were absorbing the consequences of the Donnie Brasco operation, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra was facing a betrayal on an entirely different scale. Tommaso Buscetta was not a peripheral figure in the Sicilian organization. He was a senior member with connections to the highest levels of the Palermo families, and a sophisticated understanding of the organization's structure that few individuals possessed. His decision to cooperate with anti-mafia magistrate Giovanni Falcone in 1984 represented the first time a senior member of Cosa Nostra in Sicily had ever agreed to tell investigators the full truth about what the organization was. Buscetta had lived through the Second Mafia War of the early 1980s, in which the Corleonese faction under Salvatore Riina had killed hundreds of rival family members across Sicily in a systematic campaign to consolidate total control over the organization. 2 of Buscetta's sons and other close relatives had been killed in those years. The organization had directly destroyed his family. He was arrested in Brazil in 1983 and extradited to Italy, where Falcone persuaded him to cooperate. What Buscetta provided was not simply names and locations. He provided a structural and cultural map of Cosa Nostra, how it was organized, how decisions were made, how the cupola operated, who held power and why, and how the organization had evolved over decades. His testimony became the foundation of the Maxi trial of 1986 to 1987, in which Falcone prosecuted 475 defendants, obtaining 360 convictions, including life sentences for Riina and other senior figures. The scale of what Buscetta enabled had no precedent in Italian legal history. Riina, who had ordered the killings that destroyed Buscetta's family, was eventually arrested in 1993. Buscetta lived under American witness protection from 1984 until his death from cancer in New Jersey in 2000. He never returned to Sicily. Henry Hill, 1980. Henry Hill was a Lucchese family associate who had never been formally made. His Irish heritage disqualified him from full membership in an organization that required full Italian ancestry, but who had operated inside the Lucchese network since adolescence and had been trusted with significant responsibilities, including his involvement in the 1978 Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy Airport, at the time the largest cash robbery in American history, in which approximately $5 million in cash and jewels were stolen from the airline's cargo facility. The aftermath of the Lufthansa robbery became a crisis within the Lucchese organization almost immediately. Jimmy Burke, the associate who had planned and executed the heist, began systematically killing the participants who knew the full details of what had occurred and where the money had gone, rather than paying out the shares that had been promised. At least 6 of the robbery's participants were killed in the months that followed. Hill, who was increasingly aware that his own name was moving up Burke's list, was arrested on narcotics charges in 1980. Facing substantial prison time, he agreed to cooperate with the FBI. His testimony and the information he provided led to the conviction of Jimmy Burke for the 1979 murder of Richard Eaton, a separate killing unrelated to the Lufthansa robbery. Burke received a 25-year sentence and died in prison in 1996 without the Lufthansa murder convictions that the investigation had originally targeted, as Hill's testimony alone was insufficient to secure conviction. convictions on those charges without corroboration. Hill also provided testimony that contributed to several other convictions within the Lucchese network. He entered the Witness Protection Program, was removed from it twice for continued criminal activity, and eventually abandoned the program's protection entirely. He died in Los Angeles in 2012. The Lufthansa money was never recovered. Sammy the Bull Gravano, 1991. The most consequential informant in the history of the American Mafia was not a soldier or a low-ranking associate. He was the underboss of the most powerful family in the country, a man who had committed 19 murders, been trusted by his boss with the most sensitive operational decisions of the organization, and stood at the center of the Gambino family's power structure for more than a decade. Salvatore Gravano's cooperation came directly from his boss's failure to follow the organization's own rules. The FBI had planted recording devices in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, the location where John Gotti held court, in violation of the Fourth Commandment's prohibition on frequenting visible social venues. On a recording made on December 12, 1989, Gotti was captured speaking disparagingly about Gravano to an associate, suggesting that Gravano's construction businesses were growing too large and that the same pattern of eliminating partners who created problems was being applied to those situations. Gravano, shown the recording by federal prosecutors after his arrest in December 1990, concluded that Gotti was preparing to have him killed to eliminate a witness and competitor simultaneously. His cooperation was arranged through an approach to prosecutors made via his wife, in violation of the rule that wives be kept entirely separate from organizational business. Once his decision was confirmed, his testimony over 9 days at Gotti's 1992 trial was comprehensive, detailed, and devastating. He described the organizational structure of the Gambino family, the murder of Paul Castellano, the mechanisms through which Gotti had maintained control, and 10 murders in which Gotti had been personally involved. Gotti was convicted on all 13 counts on April 2, 1992, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of cancer in a federal prison hospital in June 2002. Gravano served 5 years for 19 murders and was released into the Witness Protection Program. He abandoned the program after a period in Arizona and was subsequently arrested in 2000 for running an ecstasy distribution ring in Arizona and New York. He served 19 years on those charges and was released in 2017. His FBI handler George Gabriel stated publicly that Gravano's cooperation arguably led to the demise of organized crime in New York. Frank Bompensiero, 1967 to 1977. Frank Bompenciero's case illustrates a different kind of betrayal, one that was not discovered until it was too late for the organization to do anything about it except absorb the damage. Bompensiero was a senior member of the Los Angeles family, a longtime associate of the Chicago outfit's operations on the West Coast, and a man whose organizational credentials and loyalty to the traditional values of Cosa Nostra were entirely unquestioned, until the FBI revealed after his death that he had been one of their most productive informants for a period of at least 10 years. Bompenciero's cooperation with the FBI began in the mid-1960s and continued until his murder in February 1977, when he was shot and killed in a phone booth in Pacific Beach, California. He had become suspicious to members of the Los Angeles organization, but the specific extent of his cooperation was not fully understood until federal investigations in the years following his death revealed the scope of what he had provided. His information had contributed to investigations of organized crime operations across multiple cities and had allowed the FBI to document the activities of senior figures in the Los Angeles, San Diego, and Chicago operations in ways that would otherwise have been impossible. The Los Angeles family's effective destruction in the decades that followed owed something to the structural intelligence Bompensiero had provided over the course of his informant relationship, intelligence that informed how federal investigators approached the organization long after Bompensiero himself was gone. The full extent of his cooperation remains partially classified. He was buried in San Diego. The men who had trusted him had no idea, until years after his death, exactly how long they had been confiding in someone who was reporting everything to the FBI. Luigi Big Gigi Ilardo, 1996. The Sicilian Mafia's penetration from the inside by law enforcement produced one of the most remarkable and personally costly cases of undercover cooperation in the history of anti-mafia investigations. Luigi Ilardo was not a peripheral Cosa Nostra associate. He was a member of the Catania family with direct connections to the highest levels of the Sicilian organization, including a family relationship to Benedetto Santapaola, one of the most powerful bosses in eastern Sicily. His decision to cooperate with Colonel Mario Mori of the Carabinieri's ROS unit in 1994 gave Italian investigators features their deepest penetration of the Sicilian Mafia's upper echelons at a time when the organization was still recovering from the devastating consequences of the Maxi trial. Gallardo's cooperation produced specific and actionable intelligence over a 2-year period. He led investigators to the location of Bernardo Provenzano, the most wanted man in Italy, a fugitive since 1963, who would not be captured until 2006. In 1995, acting on Gallardo's information, Carabinieri officers located a farmhouse near Mezzogiusso where Provenzano was believed to be staying. The arrest operation was ordered and then, controversially, called off at the last moment by superior officers, whose specific reasoning has never been fully explained publicly and remains a subject of investigation and litigation in Italy to this day. Gallardo was preparing to emerge publicly as a pentito, a formal state witness, in May 1996. 4 days before his scheduled formal cooperation agreement, he was killed. The investigation into who ordered his killing and who within the Italian state may have alerted his organization to his impending public cooperation has generated decades of legal proceedings, with several former senior officials eventually indicted on related charges. Provenzano remained free for another decade. Gallardo's case remains one of the most contested and unresolved episodes in the history of the Italian state's relationship with Cosa Nostra. Joseph Massino, 2004. Every American mafia boss who faced serious federal prosecution in the era after the RICO Act maintained one consistent position: they would not cooperate. They would take their sentences. They would serve their time. The code applied at every level, including the top. That position held across every prosecution of every family from the commission trial of 1986 onward, until Joseph Massino. Massino was known as the Last Don, a designation that referred not to any mythological status but to the simple fact that by the late 1990s, he was the only boss of any New York family who was not serving a prison sentence. He had rebuilt the Bonanno family from the devastation of the Donnie Brasco infiltration, restored its reputation within the commission, re-established its operational discipline by closing the social clubs and restructuring how information moved through the organization, and maintained a level of personal security that had kept him out of federal prosecution for longer than any of his contemporaries. He was arrested in January 2003 and convicted on July 30th, 2004, on 11 counts covering 7 murders and a quarter-century of racketeering. Immediately after the verdict, as the courtroom was clearing, Massino asked to speak privately with the judge. He offered to cooperate. The prospect that had triggered his decision was the death penalty. Federal prosecutors had charged him with a separate murder that made him potentially the first American mafia boss to face execution since Louis Buchalter in 1944. Massino made his calculation and broke. He provided testimony that contributed to the conviction of his own successor, Vincent Bassiano, and to the resolution of multiple Bonanno family murders, including the identification of burial sites in Ozone Park, Queens, known as The Hole, where investigators subsequently found the remains of 3 senior family members killed in 1981. He wore a recording device in jail and taped conversations with Bassiano in which Bassiano discussed the assassination of a federal prosecutor. Massino was the first sitting boss of a New York crime family ever to turn state's evidence. He was sentenced to time served and released under supervision in 2013. He died in September 2023. Giovanni Brusca, 1996. Giovanni Brusca's betrayal is the most morally complex on this list because he was also one of the most violent and brutal figures in the history of organized crime. He was the man who personally detonated the bomb that killed Magistrate Giovanni Falcone on the Palermo Highway on May 23, 1992, the assassination that shocked Italy into the legislative response that ultimately destroyed much of what remained of Cosa Nostra's institutional power. He was responsible for dozens of murders over 2 decades, including the killing of an 11-year-old child whose father had become a state witness. He was by any measure among the most dangerous members the Sicilian Mafia had produced. When Brusca was arrested in May 1996, he had been a fugitive for 8 years. In prison, facing multiple life sentences with no prospect of release under any circumstances, he made the decision that the organization he had served had abandoned him. He began cooperating with Italian authorities. His testimony, unlike that of most pentiti, did not come from a position of relative weakness. He had nothing to negotiate, no sentence that could be meaningfully reduced, no deal that would make a material difference to his life expectancy in prison. He cooperated, as he has stated in subsequent public accounts, out of a combination of pragmatic calculation about the organization's future and a genuine acknowledgement of what he had done. The information he provided over the years following his arrest contributed to numerous prosecutions of senior Cosa Nostra figures across Sicily and to a more granular understanding of the organization's decision-making structure in the years before and after the Falcone assassination. He was released from prison in June 2021 under Italy's Pentito statute after serving 25 years and was placed under protective supervision. prison. His release generated intense public controversy in Italy, particularly among the families of his victims. He remains alive in an undisclosed location under a protection arrangement whose details are not publicly disclosed. Each of these 10 betrayals broke something that the organization had believed was permanent. Some broke individual families. Some broke the institutional architecture of the entire American Mafia. Some are still working their way through the courts, decades after the men who caused them are dead. The oath at the center of all of it was simple: loyalty before everything, flesh burning if it was violated. Every man on this list took that oath. Every one of them eventually decided it was not worth the cost. Thanks for watching.